It's again early morning in your place, Stuart? Probably, huh? Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Yes, yeah, it's about 9 a.m. for me.
Well, that's not too bad. Yeah.
No, that's not too bad for this, but unfortunately, for the rest of the conference, it's like from 12:30 a.m. through 5 a.m. or something like this. So sadly, I haven't been able to catch any of the papers. But.
Yeah, but I mean, this is understandable. I think everybody.
Yeah. Apologies to everyone, because it's a great program, and I may get in touch with people.
Yeah, it was also really interesting today and yesterday, and 2 more days to go, which is kind of a little bit exhausting. Yeah.
Yeah. I wish we could all be in the same place. It would have been an awesome gathering, but oh well.
Maybe next year. I mean, we are all still hoping that we will be able to go to Warsaw.
Yes.
Fingers crossed. Yeah. And then we can definitely also enjoy a nice beer after the lecture.
Yeah.
Maybe we can start.
Yeah, sure.
So, good evening or good morning, everyone, wherever you are. I am very pleased to introduce today our second keynote lecture, Professor Julia Budka. She's professor of Egyptian archaeology and art at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich since 2015. And she was the principal investigator for the European Research Council project Across Borders, which investigated the settlement patterns in Egypt and Nubia in the second millennium BC. And since 2019, she is for the second time, the principal investigator of a second ERC grant for the Diverse Nile project, whose main goal is to refine the cultural entanglement concept in New Kingdom Nubia. Her specialty fields are field archaeology and material culture, and she conducts excavations in Sudan and Egypt, both at funerary and settlement sites, especially at Luxor, in Asasif, at the Sai Island, and in the Sudanese region between Atab to Ferka. So please, Professor Budka.
Yeah, many thanks to the organizers and for this kind introduction, and many thanks for joining this lecture. I will try to share my screen, and let's see if this works. Should be okay, huh? Everybody can see the screen? Yeah. Okay, so many thanks again for giving me this opportunity to introduce my new ERC project, Diverse Nile, in this keynote. And it's all about cultural diversity in New Kingdom Nubia, so it will tackle a lot of the things we already heard about in the conference. So the outline of the lecture is the following. I will give a very brief introduction, then I will also very briefly talk about the height of the Kerma Empire, the classical Kerma era. Then I will switch to cultural diversity in archaeological research and give some examples from the Nile Valley. And then the main focus will be on New Kingdom Nubia and what we can say about cultural encounters. And the last part of the lecture will be dedicated to the new project, the Diverse Nile project. Yeah, so let's start with a very short introduction. I mean, all of you know that there are several differences. Could I maybe ask the colleagues at the IFAO to take back the host, because then you can let the people in and I don't have to take care of the waiting room? Would this be possible? Okay, let's just see whether it works. Many thanks. Okay, thanks. So within the Nile Valley, there are, of course, clear differences between the lower Nile in Egypt and the middle Nile in modern Sudan. And there are topographical, geological differences. And this also resulted in partly different lifestyles. All of this is common knowledge. And It is also common knowledge that between Egypt and Nubia, there were very complex cultural encounters over the millennia, not only in the New Kingdom, and that they included cultural mixing, intermingling, whatever you want to call it. And especially in the recent years, there has been much progress thanks to new fieldwork in Egyptian colonial towns in New Kingdom, Nubia. This slide is just a kind of a short reminder about basic information about borders, frontiers, contact zones between Egypt and modern Sudan. I think this is very, very common knowledge, and most of you have already joined the keynote lecture by Stuart on Saturday, so you also heard about some aspects of this already. And all of you also know that until quite recently, modern Sudan, ancient Nubia, was traditionally viewed from an Egyptian perspective, and this resulted in certain shortcomings assessing African indigenous cultures. Well, more recent work has clearly shown that impenetrable boundaries and prominent ethnic categorizations are just a modern construct, a modern conception, and are definitely not supportable. You also know that the Egyptian presence in the Middle Kingdom and in the New Kingdom resulted in certain conversions of the Egyptian culture in the Middle Nile Valley. And this was first labeled as so-called Egyptianization, and now the research is more inclined to call it cultural entanglement, especially what happened in the second millennium BCE. And again, Stuart told you already a lot about this. Well, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm a big fan of cultural entanglement. I think it's a great advancement for our understanding of cultural encounters in Nubia. However, the thing is that everything that was done concerning cultural entanglement in New Kingdom Nubia happened at central sites, at elite places. And so I'm afraid, and I think that our model of so-called cultural entanglement in New Kingdom Nubia still holds an elite bias. And I've just mentioned the most important new excavations that contributed to these advancements. And of course, the key work was done by Stuart and his team at Tombos. So what I would say is that we still do not understand everything that is between our central sites. So we actually have little knowledge about this. And so we are lacking a lot of data because the periphery within the Nile Valley has not yet been sufficiently addressed. And we furthermore have a challenge for our understanding because a lot of the work is focusing on funerary remains, especially if we go outside the main centers. So I will come back to this, but just keep this in mind as a kind of a preliminary introduction. Let's now very briefly focus on the Kerma kingdom and especially the classical Kerma state. Here's definitely not the place and not the time to talk about everything of this extremely interesting African empire and its complex evolution. I just want to follow here Bruce Williams, who stressed very recently what you can see here on the slide, both on the map and in the quotation I brought for you, that in the classical Kerma time, the Kerma Empire was really at its height, included most parts of Sudan, even reached into Egypt. And what is here really important, and I just quote Bruce in this respect, for the first time, Kush united a long stretch of the Middle Nile Valley into a functioning political unit. And within this political unit, we have social groups that remained distinct. He mentions especially the Egyptian settlers and the Kushites, the Kerma people. But the C group and the Pangrave cultures grew closer together in C group phase 3. And this is, again, very important, helping to pave the way for a far-reaching cultural transformation amounting to a conversion that began in this period, so in the second intermediate period, if you want to talk in Egyptian terms, and was completed in the next phase. So I think there's much food for thought here, and you do not have to agree with everything, but it's a very, very important remark that also stresses that we do have to differentiate between Lower Nubia, where we do have a strong C group and Pangrave presence, which is different to what we have in so-called Upper Nubia. So in the classical Kerma time, Lower Nubia was really something that we can call multicultural. Another aspect which has recently been addressed by several scholars is that it is quite challenging to address Kerma sites, and especially Kerma settlement sites, beyond Kerma city. So there are some very important sites which have been partly also excavated. Not all of them have yet been published. We have the important site of Gizm El Arba, close to Kerma. We have Hanek, close to Tombos. We have the site H25 near to Kawa. And otherwise, the list is already getting a little bit less sufficient. So we do have a lot of cemeteries. And this brings us again to this kind of religious bias if we really want to address the socio-cultural factors that shaped this empire. So we definitely need more of the peripheral Kerma sites. And this was, for example, also mentioned by Brigitte Gracienne, who is without doubt one of the key persons if we want to talk about Kerma cultures. And she pointed out, together with the map you see on the slide, that it's sometimes really tricky and difficult to identify Kerma remains outside of Kerma. Recent research was especially working in the Fourth Cataract region and area, and identified also Kerma remains. And I also want to mention the recent work by Claudia Neser at Mokrat Island, where only mortuary remains were found, but they also add up very importantly to our understanding of the Kerma Empire. Most of you know that I have worked on Sai Island in the last 10 years. And one of the Sai Island is not only one of the largest islands in the Nile, but also probably the northernmost stronghold of the Kerma kingdom. And this in all Kerma periods. So we have really everything attested from Kerma Ancienne. But in the Kerma Classic time, we do have monumental tumuli that you see here also in the picture. And we have other evidence that obviously there was a very large community of Kerma Nubians on this island, and that the island, which is also mentioned already in the Middle Kingdom execration text, was of importance and was always of concern for the Egyptians on their way towards Kerma. We do have the toponym Sha'at, which you see on the screen, and this is also always interpreted as the toponym for Sai. And also this is for sure true. I just wonder whether Sha'at in the Egyptian perspective did not mean maybe more than just the island. Maybe it was a kind of a region. So it is possible that especially this very large Kerma empire in the Kerma Classic time functioned a little bit differently, and that we had maybe subordinate centers, like also Bruce think that it is possible. And therefore I have just, this is really hypothetical, yeah, but those two circles just mark the region, the hinterland, the periphery of Sai, which could have been a label that was meant with Sha'at. And just remember that the very northern side where we do have considerable Kerma remains is Mirgissa. And so I just dared to make the circle from Sai until Mirgissa. But again, this is nothing we can prove yet, but we definitely should think about it. And this is more or less to conclude about this important political unit in the Middle Nile in classical Kerma times, of which we know little about the internal structure. So it is very clear that we have the heartland around Kerma city, around the Third Cataract, probably until Kawa, maybe beyond. This is what I indicated on the map. But then again, was there a separate region in the Sai region? What is with Lower Nubia, where we have this multicultural evidence? What about the Fourth Cataract? It's also something which is a little bit beyond the Dongola reach. And of course, we also know that in the Gash Delta in Eastern Sudan, there are connections, and of course, there is also a kind of a Kerma presence in Southern Upper Egypt, but for now, I just really want to focus on that although we can trace the importance of this Kerma empire, we still know little about how it worked internally. And this is why regional approaches in modern Sudan are so important. So recent research projects, which are partly still ongoing, partly have already been concluded. And there's a large list of people that could be mentioned here. I just wanted to mention Geoff Emberling and his work at the Fourth Cataract, Henrik Panea and his work at the Fourth Cataract, Andrea Manzo and his important work in the Gash Delta in Eastern Sudan, Claudia Neser and her work in the Abu Hamad reach, and now my own ERC Diverse Nile project, which is kind of working in the area between the so-called Apri Delgo reach and the Batn el Haga. So really in a border zone, if you want, in a region that is between very distinctive physiographic zones. I mentioned already the recent field projects that are now also taking the so-called hinterland periphery into account. And another very important aspect about recent studies on classical Kerma is that there are several new, very inspiring studies that focus on material entanglement in classical Kerma times and that focus on the socio-cultural relations. And I just want to mention as an example, Elizabeth Miner, Bruce Williams, Jessica Agman-Kynes, Gianluca Minacci, and Carl Walsh. And I took one table out of the very, very inspiring thesis by Jessica Agman-Kynes on this slide, where she kind of was working on both settlement evidence and funerary evidence and concluded, and this is just what I will read here, that individual Kerma communities experience disparate effects of Nubian-Egyptian interactions throughout the Nubian Bronze Age and beyond. So with this, I hope that I could make it clear that because of all this new research going on, it is now really timely to investigate the cultural diversity of the Middle Nile. And this brings me to the third part of my lecture. So let's now focus briefly on cultural diversity itself. I just guess that probably quite a lot of you have come across this so-called 4 layers of diversity after Gardenswartz and Rowe in modern contexts, in different contexts. And it goes without saying that this model of 4 layers with the personality as the first layer, and then you see it internal dimension, external and organizational dimensions, that this is not exactly what we need for archaeology and what applies for archaeological research. But as a starting point, I just wanted to mention it. And if we look into archaeological research, it's quite obvious that cultural diversity was getting trendy in the 1980s. And this is, of course, associated with new understandings and new approaches to what we label as a culture. And I just quote here Jones and Leonard, who said that, I quote, "The basic matter of diversity is how quantities of artifacts are distributed among classes." And with this, it's already quite clear that notions of diversity have, of course, a very long history in archaeology and were already addressed in the 19th century, if you want. But the thing is, they were more or less intuitively done and formulated, and not with measurable things like it was now conducted in the 1980s. Just a short note, diversity is clearly the measure of variation and not variation per se. And with this, diversity studies offer potential for resolving functional and processional relationships. And I took this quote because for me and my work, this is really important, because I'm interested in the processes. And this concept allows us to kind of work on functional processional relationships. And so therefore, for many cases, cultural diversity proved a useful archaeological construct because it's context related, it's data related, and this normally works well in our fields. And most of you will know that in the last years, both in Egyptian, but especially in Sudanese archaeology, there was much progress in respect of variability and diversity. Another thing I want to mention is that from my perspective, I believe that the diversity construct allows us to move a little bit beyond identity, because we can also include the so-called external factors, organizational dimensions, wherever it's possible. But this again helps to really focus on processes and not be stuck with identity and personality. Yeah, on this slide, I have just collected some important aspects of cultural diversity in the archaeological record. And this is, of course, not exhaustive. And most of you will see, if I write gender, age, ethnicity, origin, social complexity, subsistence strategies, etc., that this is, of course, these are aspects that archaeology of cultural encounters, of course, addresses. But again, with the construct of diversity, it allows us to kind of have this framework, this umbrella. Yeah, and I would now like to give a few examples of cultural diversity along the Nile. Some of them have already been tackled throughout the conference from various perspectives with various case studies. I will now give case studies from the Middle Nile. And if we want to talk about cultural diversity, one really important factor is, of course, food cultures, cooking practices. And especially in Egypt, we do have texts and iconography if we want to refer to cooking practices. For modern Sudan, cooking ware, faunal remains, botanical remains, and organic residue analysis are the key sources, but again, definitely not exhaustive. Let's start with ceramics and pottery. I take again one of the wonderful examples by Stuart from his work at Ascoot. Well, in Nubia and within the framework of cultural encounters, the colonial sites in Nubia, the difference between so-called Egyptian and Nubian pottery, which was produced differently, we have the wheel-made pottery, the handmade pottery, was always taken as an indicator for common or diverse culinary practices. So what you can see here is what Stuart collected for the service dishes, the cooking dishes, the storage dishes. And if you kind of check the percentages and shapes, then you get a nice indicator for this question. And seemingly there seem to be distinctive cuisines in Nubia. And for the case study from Ascoot, Stuart proposed that the very high frequency of Nubian cooking pots in the New Kingdom could be an indication that Nubian servants and or wives were maybe cooking at the Egyptian colonial sites. This is definitely a kind of a well-argued assumption, but it's of course also not the only assumption we can make from this, but it again shows that we are talking about social roles, about gender issues, etc. if we look at some other cooking pots at New Kingdom sites, especially at examples from Sai, we again have this kind of distinctive co-appearance of wheel-made Egyptian pots and handmade Nubian style cooking pots. But what also appears, and this was already mentioned for other case studies, especially from the Near Eastern Delta, in this conference, we also have so-called hybrid wares. Wheel-made cooking pots that show some Nubian style decoration. And I'm still wondering whether, or I'm inclined to think that Anne Seiler had a very brilliant idea back in almost 20 years ago, or more than 20 years ago, when she thought that the new shape of the cooking pot that appears in Egypt in the 18th dynasty was maybe inspired from Nubian shapes and maybe also triggered by this abundance of hybrid wares that appear especially in the First Cataract area. So there's a lot of research that we should invest in this respect, I think. For my own research on Sai, we could prove that proper Egyptian cooking vessels were imported to Nubia, to the colonial sites. So sometimes I have the feeling that we always think only the Nubians were traveling with their cooking pots and the Egyptians were not that attached to their cooking ware, but the Sai example shows that also the Egyptian going to Sai really wanted to have her own cooking pot with it. Yeah, talking about other things related to food cultures, we have, of course, to consider the faunal and botanical evidence, and potential questions we can ask is whether something is typical Egyptian versus typical Nubian, and there would be, for example, things like fish and pig you can investigate, because both are associated with so-called food taboos, and especially the pig is very much associated with New Kingdom Nubia, and it appears on the colonial sites. But also the question of whether barley or emmer is dominant is something where you can kind of talk about certain differences and certain aspects of diversity. Well, to make it short, if we investigate the foodways at Egyptian colonial towns in Nubia like Sai, the result was that it is neither Egyptian nor Nubian, but it's something rather new. It's an adaptation of a tradition. It's obviously also a result of what we can call entanglement. Another thing I want to briefly mention, because again, for me, this will be the key for new ideas, for new results in the hopefully near future, and this is organic residue analysis. This technique has improved in the last years. It's so important, and we definitely have to do this. And until now, only a few samples, again from Stuart, from Ascot, have been published. And Stuart could very nicely show that in different types of pots, obviously different food was prepared. And this is, of course, fantastic. And we need larger series. We need to include the hybrid pots. And yeah, I'm just very positive that this will happen in the near future. Yeah, and with this, I switched to New Kingdom Nubia and to colonial and other encounters, as I labeled it, with some case studies. And yeah, I just start with the most recent article by Stuart, which I can just recommend to all of you in the Oxford Handbook of Ancient Nubia. You see it on the screen. On the right side of the screen, I just put one of the very famous pictures that most of you will know. This is the picture of Nubians in front of the Viceroy Hui in Thebes. And several times in the conference, we mentioned already the so-called concept of topos and mimesis. So of course, here we have the topos of the Egyptians viewing Nubians as very diverse, partly very Egyptian, partly very African, etc., etc. So I do not want to go into too much detail, because a lot of research, a lot of written papers have focused on this. What is more important is what Stuart very nicely already highlighted in his abstract of this article, that because of this very complex and variable Nubian experience of Egyptian domination, it really had the effect, and this fits perfectly to the main theme of this conference, is that the Egyptian self and the Nubian other was definitely challenged, and that both the indigenous and the colonial society was transformed, and that we are finding now new and especially local solutions. And I will try to follow in this respect and show you some examples that support this assumption. Pottery is, of course, extremely valuable here. The pottery on Sai, which was also investigated by means of petrographical and chemical analysis, clearly showed that we have a complex mixture of lifestyles, not only with the hybrid products, but also with imported Egyptian ware in Nile clay, in Amal clay, etc. But of course, also the abundance of Nubian material on the site. When I started working on Sai 10 years ago, one of the key questions was, of course, what about the identity of those occupants at Sai and their origins? Are they kind of local or non-local? Are they Egyptians? Are they Nubians? Or shall we call them something else, maybe Egyptianized Nubians? We now know that this is not a term we should use. But case studies like Nebi that you see here, who had an Egyptian type of object with his stone shabti, an Egyptian name, an Egyptian title, by no means does this, of course, mean that he was Egyptian from origin. And while our fieldwork was going on, it of course became very clear that what Michel Bousson and Stuart proposed for their evidence at Tombos also holds true for other colonial sites, that we have this entanglement of cultures, even also a biological entanglement. And for Sai, I could very clearly show, thanks to the excavations in the town, that it's also always a question of dating if we are asking about their identity and the social status, because Sai was at the beginning just kind of more or less a station for the Egyptians on the way to Kerma, and then just eventually in the time of Thutmose III, it evolved into an administrative center. So it's a big difference for Sai if we talk about the early 18th dynasty people living there, the mid 18th dynasty people living there, the late 18th dynasty people living there, or the Ramesside people. And we have attested all of them, and it's just fantastic to see this evolution. And furthermore, working both in the settlement and in the town on Sai, it became also very, very clear that it's actually all about reconstructing the communities, the social communities, the burial communities, and the practices. All of them were inhabitants of New Kingdom Sai, and even within one tomb, they showed a large degree of variability. And this can be best explained by our newly discovered tomb 26 on Sai Island. It's one of those typical Egyptian type of rock-cut tombs with a pyramidal superstructure. Tomb 26 was really stunning because it was used for a very long time, from the 18th dynasty all the way to Napatan times. And we had 36 more or less well-preserved burials, and for sure more people were buried in this tomb. The most important thing was we found undisturbed family interments of the 18th dynasty. And I will just briefly show you some of them. This is the plan of the tomb, and this is just the dense situation of all 18th dynasty burials we had in this chamber. In another chamber, we were lucky enough to find inscribed objects. And what you can see here is the burial assemblage of a person we know by name. His name is Thutmose, and we also know his title. He was the overseer of Goldsmith. And he was equipped with a completely Egyptian burial assemblage, including very high status objects like this stone shabti and this stone heart scarab. Well, of course, I wanted to know whether Thutmose was originating from was local to Sai or whether he came maybe as a colonialist from Egypt. And so this is why we conducted strontium isotope analysis. And the results were really nice, because in our case, all the human individuals we tested from our tomb were completely consistent within the local range. So I do not propose that all of them were local to Sai, but they were local to Nubia, local to this, say, region of Sha'at, whatever it means, but to the closer neighborhood of Sai. And what you can see here is actually the value for Khnum, Mose. One female was buried together with him. So this is the presumed wife, the person, the female person with him. She's also perfectly local. She's interesting because obviously in her very early life, she was probably living somewhere else. So maybe, I don't know, closer to the south. This is something we will have to investigate with further data, with larger data sets. And one last thing about the strontium, because just very recently, assessing all of the archaeological remains, I was able to identify, at least hypothetically, Khnum Mose's father. It could also be his uncle, but it's definitely a male that is one generation older than Khnum Mose. And he is also perfectly within the local range. And this is important because this more or less makes it very, very unlikely that Khnum Mose is the descent of Egyptian colonialists. But it rather implies that this complete family that was buried in this tomb had family ties in Nubia, in Upper Nubia. During the discussion today, and the question raised by Urosh earlier, the importance about females, women and children. Children were not mentioned. I wanted to mention here that, of course, if we talk about communities, we also have always have to keep in mind the females and the children. They are sometimes difficult to address in the settlement remains, but in the tombs we normally have them. And in this tomb we had a lot of females, we had a lot of children. The interesting thing is, what you can see here in the lower part are two female burials that are more or less contemporaneous, so maybe really 5-10 years apart, but they completely differ in terms of burial assemblage. She was buried in a coffin, she was not coffined, but both had inlays made in bone. And we also had ivory inlays in this tomb, and they kind of are very close to what we know from Kerma. And this use of ivory and bone also seems to be a kind of a more or less Nubian tradition. She also had a wonderful bracelet, an ivory bracelet, which also seems to be a Nubian cultural marker. And those intriguing and still difficult to explain inlays were actually associated with an infant burial. So to make it short, the females are less streamlined to the Egyptian burial tradition. They show a larger, even larger variety, I would say, and they also show those Nubian cultural markers. Yeah, I have to see that I don't talk too long. There are definitely some lessons we can learn from colonial Sai, and especially from this tomb as a case study. What you see in the back is actually one of the other female burials, which is again completely different. She had a golden ring, a lot of pottery vessels, etc. So I could here really talk just about Tomb 26, which I'm not going to do, but what do we learn from this interesting context? Well, I believe that the variability we encounter in this tomb, the variability of funerary practices within the overarching common repertoire of burial customs adopted from Egyptian standards, is deeply rooted in distinct social practices, and that they reflect aspects of the social composition of the community with this family tomb. It was really nicely to show. We have to keep individual choices and personal preferences in mind. And this perfectly ties into what, for example, Claudia Neser proposed, Renan Lemos proposed, and also Stuart Tyson-Smith, that we should and must consider New Kingdom Nubia as more diverse than previously thought, and that we have those regional preferences. And the last lesson I learned from SAI, and this brings me to my new project, is that if we really want to achieve a more comprehensive picture of past communities in the Middle Nile region, we need to assess the degree of diversity also beyond the elite context. We need non-elite contexts. Yeah, and this brings me to where we are now. The ERC Diverse Nile project was launched in 2020 under the umbrella of the Munich University Atapto Ferker region, Ferker survey project, sorry. The concession area is marked here. Here, just to contextualize it, you have the Lake Nasser, you have the Batn el Haga, and of course you have Amara West and Sai Island. The complete title of the project is not so important, but it is focusing on cultural diversity in the Middle Nile Valley, and it focuses on what I call a contact space of state-built foundations. And this should become more clear if we zoom in with this map. You see that Amara West and Sai both are state-built foundations of colonial Egypt in Nubia. They are very, very close. And with the Dal Cataract and the start of the Batn el Haga, we do have here something that we can also call a kind of a border region. We have rich evidence for diverse Nubian groups and Egyptian groups in this part of the Nile Valley, especially during the Bronze Age. And what the project aims for is that we want to provide with fresh archaeological and scientific evidence a new understanding of the cultural groups, we hope that with a combined assessment of villages, settlements, and cemeteries in combination with a landscape biography approach, this will be feasible. And I, again, don't want to be misunderstood. If I use peripheries, I never kind of imply the core periphery paradigm, but what we also want to show is that also in our case, a case study, what is a center, what is a periphery, can be very fluid. Yeah, so this also changes, and this is also important. However, peripheral zones are of key importance for this project. So because the main hypothesis I proposed is that this hinterland of Amara and Sai will probably show a greater cultural diversity within this contact space, where we do know that diverse populations were inhabited and where we do not have this kind of colonial elite construct of a state-built foundation. And so our concession area will allow us to kind of tackle all those different Nubian and Egyptian groups. And the important thing is also that we have quite a large concession reaching into the Western Desert. So we will also be able to kind of check whether there are some routes towards the desert, towards the oasis. So we can really also go a little bit into the hinterland and are not only focused along the Nile. Yeah, the main goal, and this brings me to the kind of theoretical, methodological aspect of the project, is that, like I said earlier, we want to kind of refine the very useful cultural entanglement concept with its current elite bias in favor of addressing actual cultural diversity in those hinterland regions, not in the state-built foundations. And I developed this new concept based on two main models. The first one is contact spaces, as proposed by Philip Stockhammer and Atanasov, where they understand social spaces. And this again ties in very nicely to the general topic of the conference. Social spaces where human actors meet, perceive, and constitute otherness. And I really liked this model. I had the only problem with it that it was kind of floating in the air. It was not tied to a proper regional perspective. And this is why I combined it with the landscape biography approach, which I also find very useful, and where I especially rely on Collen and Rennes, and how they define landscape biography, where they really take into account all cohabiting actors. So not only humans, but also animals, other organisms like plants, and especially human-made technologies. And I think for cultural encounters, human-made technologies are really, really important. Well, and the outcome of this new concept is what I call context space biography. And we will see in the next years how well this approach will really work. It is definitely clear that we will provide new archaeological and scientific evidence, because like with the Across Borders project, and also going a little bit beyond this, we will work with interdisciplinary methods. And the very positive thing is that within this concession area, we have not only settlements, but also funerary remains, etc. The project is organized into 4 main objectives, which are equaled by so-called work packages. And this is just a very short overview here. We will work on the dwelling places, on the burial grounds, on the complete material record, and this will hopefully lead to what we understand as a biography of the border landscape in this region. And just as one example, we will use, for example, food production and nutrition as cultural markers, and compare our new evidence with what we know already from SAI, from Amara West, from Kerma. And so are the local subsistence strategies really comparable to the main sites, or do we find here differences? And for example, I'm really looking forward whether we have so much pick like we had on SAI. I doubt it, but we will see what our excavations will come up with. Yeah, and of course, a project like this is only possible if you have a fantastic team, and I'm fortunate to have this. So this gives you just an overview that the project brings together a team of 9 international researchers and students. And if you want to know more about the project and the team, you are of course welcome to check out our blog site. Let's now focus a little bit on our concession area, on the working area of this project. We can build on recent or on previous research by André Villard. He conducted an archaeological survey in the 1970s. And in our concession area, he recorded more than 200 sites, and they date from the Paleolithic all the way to medieval and more recent times. So it's really an intense archaeological landscape. And based on our 2 survey seasons that we already conducted, the results are like this. We have we've not been able to kind of cover the left bank in the very northern part of our concession, but otherwise we relocated almost 160 sites by Villard, and we also added new sites. So the archaeological evidence is still there, and it's rich, and it's really, really promising. One important thing that became evident already in the first season is that if we look at the distribution of sites according to periods, we see some distinctive patterns. And I have put you on the slide the distribution of Kerma sites, which are clustering in the southern part of the concession, and the New Kingdom sites, which are even a little bit like less numerous and located in more or less similar areas. Just a short note, if I say Kerma and if I say New Kingdom, I do not contradict myself, but I mean these as chronological labels. So these are, for the moment, preliminary chronological labels. Well, if we go further towards the Dahl Cataract, the sites are almost exclusively post-Meroitic and medieval. Medieval sites are scattered throughout the concession, and this all implies that something happened in the landscape, that the landscape properties changed over the centuries, over the millennia. And we do have quite some implications that this was indeed the case. Fortunately, the Amara West project headed by Neil Spencer conducted a lot of work on landscape archaeology in the recent years, so we can rely on some of the new data this project produced. And if you, for example, look at one of those old maps, this one dates to the late 19th century, you can see that he notes here very nicely the cataract of Amara, and otherwise he has a lot of flat sand. And if you look, for example, in this part of Sai Island, the island is not very distinct from the West Bank because of those masses of sand. So this is just one case why our landscape approach is crucial to understand the ancient settlement patterns. And it becomes even more crucial thanks to the wonderful research by Mark Macklin, Jamie Woodward, and the complete team by Neil Spencer, who have published already several articles on this. And I just highlight here the most important results. They found out that the town of Amara was actually once surrounded by a paleo channel, and that there was another northern paleo channel, which is nicely illustrated here. And this northern paleo channel reaches all the way into my concession. And so this is hugely of relevance for us and to investigate our Kerma and New Kingdom sites. And it just is the direct the direct continuation of what Neil did in the last years. And that this understanding of a paleo channel, which is now not any longer visible or functioning, that this is important for understanding sites in the hinterland was already proven by Anna Stevens and Anna Garnett by a survey they conducted and published in 2017. One of the case studies in our concession is actually so-called what Villar labeled Egyptian New Kingdom sites along this paleo channel. And we revisited those sites, and I introduced for them a little bit unspecific label Bronze Age Nubian, because I think at the moment we do have no means for a cultural classification. And these sites are extremely interesting. We do have mud brick buildings, rectangular buildings, we have circular huts made in dry stone wall technique, and we do have a lot of ceramics still there in situ, so the preservation is really, really nice and good. And we do have 18th dynasty, early 18th dynasty pottery together with Kerma Classique ware. So these are sites which will be hugely important for the project. The tombs and the evidence from the mortuary landscape is also important. And I just give you here two examples. One typical Kerma tomb where a scarab made in bone was found, and one very large rock-cut tomb dating to the Ramesside period, and finding an excellent example or an excellent parallel at Amara West. So we have this peripheral tomb located outside the state-built sphere, but still referring to models that we know from the urban side. And if you want to know more about these tombs and their importance, just check out the recent blog posts by Renan Lemos, who is responsible for this work package. I just chose this example because it's so nice that this Kerma scarab was made in bone. And we did not have any bone scarabs on Sai, but bone scarabs I tested at Amara. And again, this seems to be kind of using a local traditional Nubian material to actually make an Egyptian object out of it. And Egyptian is here, of course, with quotation marks. Yeah, I will finish in a few minutes. Just one last remark on the work packages we are having. Material culture is, of course, a very broad topic. For the moment, we are focusing on pottery, and here it is especially Julia D'Ercole, who kind of continues her petrographical and chemical analysis of New Kingdom material of both Kerma and Egyptian style, like she did it already for Sai. So we do have samples from our own concession, we have samples from Sai, we have samples from Dukigel, of which you can see here 2 nice examples, and we will also include the Fourth Cataract region. And this should allow us to give a nice overview of differences in technology, also within the handmade wear. So at the moment, we are really focusing on these tiny potential differences and variabilities. Yeah, and I'm finally coming to a kind of short conclusion and also an outlook. It is already now very, very clear that within this contact space, we do have various groups, and especially different groups of Nubians and Egyptian settlers, and that we have to assume that they also intermingled, very similar to what we know from the colonial sites, and that this resulted in what Stewart labeled as a kind of a transformation of the self and the other. And this makes it so interesting to work in this region and in this period. I also mentioned with the case study from Sai that in internal cultural factors, individual choices, individual careers, these are so important, and they differ, of course, regarding social context. So the big question will be whether we will find different solutions in our tiny peripheral villages compared to what we had in the administrative center at Sai. What is still definitely a clear work in progress is the terminology. This is something that will eventually come up during the project. Maybe we will have to talk about various cultural horizons in the Atap Tuferca region, in the Sha'ad region. We will see, but this is work in progress. And finally, I think that what I presented should hopefully make it clear that the complexity of cultural dynamics we encounter just indicate that there was not the one New Kingdom Nubia, and probably also not the one lower and the one upper Nubia, but that there were rather multiple newly shaped and highly interesting Nubias. And with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. There's a lot of work ahead of us, and I'm very grateful to all the support of the institutions that are mentioned on this slide, and of course to all the people that you see on the slide. Many thanks for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Julia Butka, for your very interesting and clear presentation. We have some time for questions and discussion. So if there are any questions in the room, or if you want to ask something on Zoom, you can raise your hand or just turn on the micro, or also you can write your question as well. I do have one small question, because I was wondering if you are also considering the rock inscriptions in the concession you have for this project.
Unfortunately, we do not have any rock inscriptions, at least not until now, and Vilar did not recognize any inscriptions. They are a little bit further north in the proper Dal Cataract area, but of course we do have rock drawings and rock pictures, and I will consider them, because for some rock drawing sites we can already presume that they are associated with Kerma sites. So this is another important aspect of the material culture. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, there is one. Oh yes, Uroš. Yes, sure. You can ask your question.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for a wonderful lecture, and thank you for moving the field forward in every sense.
Inshallah.
Yes. So my question, of course, maybe you would have guessed it, is there any evidence of trauma and violence on any of the bodies you studied in Sai, or from any of the bodies you found in your recent surveys, if I understood well, there were also excavations of some of the cemeteries in this desert in between regions.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really interested in this because we are always talking about these violent colonial oppressions and so on and so forth. But I'm interested in how colonial administration can also structure space.
Mm-hmm.
And as it was already argued for Tombos, maybe some communities become safer and others continue to be less safe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really, really careful myself with all of these terms because I don't want someone to grab me here for them. But yeah, this is more or less my question. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks, Uroš. It's a very good question, of course. For our new concession, I at the moment cannot answer it because, as far as I know, Villar did not document any kind of violence in the burials he excavated, and we will, inshallah, start our excavations very soon as the virus allows us. But on Sai, I would just kind of answer very shortly that in the elite cemetery we have on Sai, in this rock-cut tomb cemetery with the pyramidal superstructures, I would not expect that we find evidence for violence because this cemetery only started to be used in the Thutmosite time. So really in the time when the Egyptian administration was well established, where we do have the proper temple town, etc. And then I would just say these are really the elite people who work in the town and were buried in the cemetery. To answer this, yeah, this is what we need. We need to look in the hinterland, and then I would also expect, especially if we find those Kerma Classique cemeteries that are really at this kind of edge between Second Intermediate and New Kingdom, this will be a completely different thing. And I will think about you when we start excavating this, for sure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I will read one question in the chat. From Cynthia. So she says, thanks for a great lecture. I wonder if some modern anthropological studies in this region wouldn't be useful for possible comparisons with the processes in pharaonic times. And what about studies of what is happening in this region in the first half of the first millennium BC? Who are the Kushites of the 25th dynasty? And what is the, can you go down, please? And what is the entanglement between cultures from Nubia and Upper Egypt during the 25th dynasty?
Yeah, many thanks, dear Cynthia. The first question is, of course, extremely important, and we do have this on our minds. Within the project, I have affiliated one of our anthropologists from, cultural anthropologist from LMU. He works especially in borderlands, in border regions, and we will definitely apply this, and we will focus on this perspective as well. I cannot spoil here everything, but in terms of Napatan remains in this region, I think this will be really, really interesting in the next years, because for now I have to focus on the Bronze Age remains. But during the survey, we discovered several huge Napatan sites on the west bank of the river, and they are obviously settlement places, and this is of course fantastic to have Kushite Napatan domestic sites in this part of the Nile Valley will be hopefully investigated in the framework of a different project. So there's a lot to do still, and we do have also cemeteries that are especially pre-Napatan and Napatan. So another thing our project will allow us to tackle is also kind of the end of the New Kingdom and what happens after the New Kingdom. So a small glimpse into the pre-Napatan period will definitely be possible. Yeah, so thanks.
Okay, thank you. Is there Another question? Okay, there is one question on YouTube from Serena Nicolini. So what kind of animal bone was used to produce the inlays? Do you have evidence of partly worked animal bones that might give information about their working technology?
That's also a very, very good question. Unfortunately, our bone inlays were not checked by our animal bone specialist. But I hope that we can kind of do this in the near future. And we had some few worked bone artifacts inside in the New Kingdom town, and they were actually, but again, this is difficult to say, they were actually just small, the small ruminants, the Wiederkäuer, so sheep or goats, something like this. Not very exciting. But for the inlays, I'm quite sure they should have used something different. But we will look into this. Thanks for the question. It's a very good point. I think Linda and Stuart wanted to say something.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Sure.
Okay, I'll go first. Fabulous as always, Julia. I would think in these cultural encounters that exchanges and modifications are made in areas of life where it either matters a lot or it doesn't matter at all. And how are you going to approach such hierarchies of significance? I mean, for instance, in burials, does body position matter more than presentation of the body through jewelry, or are they the same? And how do you deal with hybridization of pottery, for instance?
Yeah. So these are very important questions, and this will be tricky, I honestly admit. The kind of the distribution of sites will kind of lead us to focus on a cluster of sites where we do have a large Kerma cemetery, a large Kerma settlement area, which was continuously used until Ramesside times. At least this is the surface finding. And here there is a New Kingdom cemetery attached. So this does not answer your question, but the strategy will be to kind of focus on what we can kind of already on the surface and what Villar documented, recognize as something seemingly different. And then we will just see within this Kerma cemetery, for example, what really comes up. And then we have to compare it to other Kerma cemeteries, and very similar in the New Kingdom tombs. So I'm afraid it's a little bit too early for me to be very specific in this respect. In terms of hybrid, we now, this is why it's great that Julia D'Ercola is also here. What we now want to focus a lot on is the chemical and petrographical analysis of our hybrid wares, and also the organic residue analysis. And I think it's all about technology. I just really want to know who was producing those hybrid things. Yeah.
Okay, I guess I'm next. So a couple of questions. One of them, looking at this question of violence that Juroš brought up, is a really interesting one. And you mentioned the sort of violence between Egypt and Nubia, but I was wondering if you had thought about and what if you were going to be looking at violence within Kerma, both interpersonal violence, just abuse basically, but then also the potential that you have different polities or different groups at various stages. We often think of Kerma, and this is exactly what you're getting at, as homogenous somehow, but in fact, it might have been factionalized.
Yeah. No, these are important things. Thanks a lot for pointing this out. No, this will be definitely one of the tasks of the anthropologists to really tell us everything about internal things and kind of domestic violence and other things that happened. The thing is, at the moment, as far as the kind of the material that Villar documented and we found during our survey, we do have several cemeteries where I would say this is very, very typical Kerma. And then we have the other cemeteries where we do have a lot of what seems to be C group. again, it will be a kind of a choice, a strategy where to excavate, and then we have to keep the fingers crossed that also the preservation is preserved. But this intercultural, or let's say inter-Nubian relations, and also potentially not so nice encounters are definitely also on our mind. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, and just a quick comment, the early Kerma assemblage at Abu Fatma has a lot of C group style pottery, which is interesting, which is of course a kind of general thing.
Because this is, but it's very, very, very much south. I mean, Abu Fatima is, again, this just shows how little we know until now. Yeah. So thanks, Stuart. Perfect.
I think yes, there was a question in the room also, or no? Okay, so Cynthia is saying, should we be careful about modern gender biases in assuming cooking was done by women, and who made the pottery?
Yeah. No, Cynthia, this is also something also Stuart himself wrote already, and the role of women was for sure complex, and we have to consider that various roles were kind of fulfilled by them. And again, I can just kind of repeat that we will now focus really on technology and production. And the good thing is that quite a number of both Nubian and Egyptian pottery leaves fingerprints. And there are some methods now where you can kind of calculate from the fingerprint. I'm not completely convinced now, but there is one colleague in Netherlands doing this. He kind of can calculate from the fingerprint what gender, what sex it is, and whether it's a sub-adult or an adult, and things like this. Will work for Egyptian bread plates, and will also, of course, work for beer jars or for Nubian handmade stuff. So we know too little about the pottery production. I completely agree. Yeah.
I think Natasha Ayers has also a question. Please.
Is she here? Ah, yeah.
So are there any questions or comments on YouTube or in the... Yes?
Thank you, Professor Julia. Just a question. The last thing you said, that we have to name nowadays not Lower Nubia and Upper Nubia. So we have to say Nubias, sure.
This is already the question, right?
Yes, because
no,
I stop for this.
No, if you ask me directly, I would say we also do not have one Egypt, and we do not have one Upper and one Lower Egypt. I think in very similar lines, we should also be careful to kind of make all the hard work we are doing. I mean, I quoted so many projects, so many people who did fantastic work, and they could show how complicated everything is and how much variety there is. And if we then still use ancient Nubia and the Nubians, they are not the Nubians, and they are not the Upper Nubians. This is what I wanted to say. And I think you just I mean, this leads, maybe we can meet in Cairo once and just discuss this in detail. But really, also Egypt is such a diverse country in antiquity, where we can differentiate the northeastern delta from the northwestern delta, etc., etc. So I just think this is the beginning of something that will probably in 10, 12, 15 years will be more or less common knowledge, that we should be very careful to kind of use simplified terms for what we are actually talking about. Very, very complex social communities who shaped their living environment. I hope that was clear.
Yes. Yes, I think, I don't see it. I think Professor Manfred Wittek has one question as well.
Ah, down.
Yes. Can you please unmute yourself?
Manfred, wir hören dich nicht.
No, it's fine, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Anyway, my question returns to some questions, previous questions. You found remains of cemeteries or sites which seem to be C group and at the same time Kerma. In the earliest phase of Kerma culture, you cannot differentiate between Kerma and C group. They have practically the same very characteristic incised wares, these flat bowls and so on. Yeah. So it would be interesting if you found very early Kerma, or is it C group? It's both possible, of course.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. That's it.
Many thanks, Manfred. Yeah, perfect.
Thank you. So if there are no more questions, and yes, from Thais? No.
There's one. Is there a question in the room? Because there's one question in the chat.
Yes, if there is one more question, I will. Which one is? Because I don't see it yet.
By Thais, as far as I see, yeah. So she asks,
Thank you.
I like the idea of landscape biographies. How do you look at the interior of settlements, houses, and combine the variability with landscape in this project? Wonderful question and very complicated questions. I already pointed out that I have this wonderful team of several postdoctoral scholars, and we will work on this problem together. Veronika Hinterhuber is also in the audience. She's the one responsible for the settlements. And what I, for now, have a little bit in mind, that we will try to use the objectscape approach for this. Renan Lemmers used the objectscape approach very successfully for his PhD, working on mortuary variability in the New Kingdom, in New Kingdom Nubia. And so the thing is, first, we really need our excavated settlements and the houses, and then we will see if objectscape will allow us to kind of combine the individual object distribution within a house with the larger landscape thing. Yeah, so I'm also positive that in the next years we will be able to tell you here more, but thankfully we will stay in touch in the next months, and I also hope in the next years. And this is definitely a very, very important issue we will be addressing in the next years. Yes, thanks.
Thank you, Julia.
Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other comments? Okay, so if not, thank you once again, Professor Julia Budka, for accepting to give this keynote lecture.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to hear on Zoom actual applause, because this is a little bit missing on the wonderful digital lectures otherwise. Thank you so much for the invitation and for this wonderful conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you also to the participants for their questions and for the discussion. So now we will close this day, and we will be ready for tomorrow morning for the third day of our conference, and not the last one yet. So thank you all, and see you tomorrow.
Ciao, ciao. See you. Bye-bye. Ciao. And many thanks again.
And for all of us, we can meet like there will be a dinner in like, I think in 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes, in the main hall of the IFAO.